I've owned the Fuji GS645S for about a year, and it's been my most used camera during that time. So I wanted to share my thoughts about the camera, as well as some of the photos that I've made with it. The GS645S is a fixed lens medium format rangefinder that shoots 645 negatives. It's compact and lightweight and feels closer to a 35mm SLR than most other medium format cameras. It's a mechanical camera with fully manual exposure controls, but it does have a built-in light meter, which takes two pretty easy to find 1.5 volt batteries. One of the great things about this camera is its affordability. This is probably due to some quirky features as well as a reputation for being a bit fragile, both of which I'll get into a bit later. For me, the ergonomics of the camera are pretty good. The exposure controls are located around the barrel of the lens, and for the most part, they're easy to set. There is a little bit of play when setting shutter speed and aperture, but I got used to it pretty quickly. ISO can be finicky to set. You need to move the other controls out of the way first and kind of get your fingernail into the very small ISO grip. The good thing is, once it's set, you know it's not going anywhere. I also like the grip on this camera, as well as the texture on the body that gives it a very solid feel in my hand. Obviously, with the 645 camera, you're getting the smallest medium format negative. At the same time, this camera is significantly smaller and lighter than a 6x6, 6x7, or 6x9 rangefinder. This camera weighs about 28 ounces, making it really easy to just throw it over your shoulder when you're going for a walk. You're barely going to notice it's there, and yet you still get that big 645 negative. It fits into camera inserts for APS-C cameras, meaning you can easily take it with you when you're traveling or even on a hike. One of the more unusual aspects of this camera is that it is in portrait orientation by default. When you bring the camera up to your eye, you are going to see those portrait frame lines, unless you turn the camera this way. It's basically a medium format half frame camera, with the 645 negative being half the size of a full frame 6x9 negative. While this might seem strange to some, I actually like it. The camera encourages me to shoot a little bit differently, and if you notice, a lot of my photos with this camera are in that portrait orientation. Although ironically, the camera is not great for actual portraits with its minimum focus distance of 1 meter. At the same time, there are two sets of threads on the camera, so you can put it on a tripod in either portrait or landscape orientation. Of all the things I like about this camera, the lens is by far its best quality. The camera has a 60mm f4 lens, which is roughly equivalent to a 35mm field of view full frame. In my experience, it's just about the perfect everyday focal length, making it a great match for a compact camera like this. This lens is also really sharp. I think this photo is a great example of what I like about the lens. I just love the amount of detail and the colors that you can get out of it. Like I mentioned earlier, this camera has a built-in light meter, and it's a really good one. This light meter has a really simple display showing a circle for correct exposure, a plus for overexposure, or a minus for underexposure. It'll also use a combination of those symbols to represent about 1/3 of a stop of over or underexposure. Simply put, I don't think this light meter has ever let me down, and I would definitely take the camera out with no external light meter and be totally confident about the results I'm gonna get. Of course, there are some downsides to the camera as well. Like most rangefinders, the minimum focus distance of 1 meter is not great. While this may not matter to you depending on your shooting style, it's definitely something to be aware of. With this camera, you only get 15 shots per roll, as opposed to 16 with other 645 cameras. Apparently you can try to squeeze an extra shot out of it, but personally I haven't tried that. The lowest aperture setting of f4 can be limiting in certain circumstances. There will likely be times where you need to bring 800 speed film with you to continue shooting into the evening. And one final minor complaint, while this camera does have a leaf shutter, it isn't the most quiet or pleasing sounding shutter out there. At the same time, the shutter does have a locking mechanism, which I definitely appreciate. If you do any amount of research about this camera, one thing I'm sure you'll find is its reputation for being fragile. In fact, the unusual cow bar or roll cage is allegedly there to protect the lens and controls from damage. And yes, this camera does have a lot of plastic on it, but I will say it doesn't feel cheap either. Personally, I've only had one issue with the camera so far. When my camera arrived, I found that the rangefinder wasn't able to keep up with the focusing mechanism. When I moved the focusing ring, the rangefinder patch and frame lines would lag behind or get completely stuck. Apparently this is a common issue because I was able to find instructions on how to fix this online. It was actually a simple fix. It involved taking this top plate off and putting a little bit of lubrication on a pin that connects the focusing ring to the rangefinder mechanism. I ended up going through this process twice, but I haven't had the same issue since then. So really all I can say is that fragility has not been an issue for me yet. Of course, my camera could break tomorrow and I would be pretty disappointed with that level of longevity. So what are my overall thoughts about this camera? I've often seen this camera recommended as the perfect starter medium format camera. And that's a big part of what convinced me to pick it up in the first place. After shooting with this camera for a year, I totally agree with that reputation. On top of that, I think this camera offers something pretty unique in the 645 format. It's much more compact and lightweight than something like a Mamiya 645, a Pentax 645, or a Bronica ETR. Of course, there is an interchangeable lens Bronica 645 rangefinder. It's also significantly more expensive than this camera. Shooting with this camera for about a year helped me decide to pick up a Mamiya 7 with the confidence of knowing that I would enjoy shooting a medium format rangefinder. But I also can't really see myself getting rid of it. It's fun to shoot with, and I do like the 645 format, getting 5 extra shots, shooting a little more freely, and having an even smaller, even lighter camera to carry around on a daily basis. So is this camera the 645 version of a Mamiya 7? Well, probably not. I don't think that's a fair comparison to make, but I will say there are some advantages to this camera over something like a Mamiya 7, and I suspect that there are a lot of people out there thinking about buying a Mamiya 7 or similar who would actually be totally satisfied with this camera.